My name is Isabella, and I live in the Pacific Northwest, and the great green state of Washington to be exact. One of my New Year's resolutions for 2020 was to lose the extra weight I had accumulated during my first pregnancy. Weight that had sapped my confidence and left me feeling kinda dumpy. My husband always told me he didn't mind, that he loved me no matter what. But I minded. It might sound a little trad wife of me, but I want to look my best for him just like he looks his best for me. But the problem is I've never ever enjoyed that vibe that seems to hang in the air at co-ed gyms. Some places have members that seem to care only about hooking up or ogling each other, while some female-only gyms are so underfunded that they just aren't worth going to. So I took up hiking. I always figured the outdoors would be super good for my mental health, and I'd gone for walks in the woods as part of fighting off the postnatal depression, which was very effective at doing so. I remember how excited I was driving out to a sporting goods store to pick up a snug pair of hiking boots, along with a lot of colorful waterproof gear, mostly in lilac, my favorite color. It felt like the start of something wonderful. I was already posting an R ultralight, asking for advice on specialist hiking gear, and I could not wait to report back on my progress. But my first serious solo hike in the woods was set to be anything but relaxing or uplifting, and it left me with a greater respect for nature's wrath than I ever thought was possible. My husband and I arranged for him to look after the baby while I drove out to Olympic National Forest for an afternoon of hiking. And swimmingly for about an hour or two as I pushed myself up hills, feeling my thighs burning and trembling when they felt the relief of a downslope. It felt amazing, exhilarating, and truly uplifting. At least until I took a tumble. I think my book caught a rock or something hidden among the earth, but whatever happened, I found myself rolling around in the dirt beneath me, holding onto my ankle as I grimaced in pain. I found I could still put a little weight on it, so it couldn't have been worse than a strain, but it still hurt like the devil. That's when the strangest, most adorable thing happened to me. A crow, a little calling black-feathered guy, flew down from a tree and landed on a tree stump nearby and began to flap his wings. He was doing little jumps, flapping all the while calling his little head off like he was singing for his supper. He had saw me take a fall and was flying down to see if I was okay. I mean, that's what it seemed like, because as soon as I said, yeah, I'm fine, I just scared myself is all. He quieted down and began eyeing me with each of the tiny black pebbles set in the skull. With my ankle still aching a little, I picked myself up, said goodbye to my new crow buddy, then began to limp back towards my car. What happened next seemed like the sweetest thing ever. My new little crow buddy actually followed me. Yeah, he followed me. So close too, just making sure I was okay. As I was shuffling back to my car, he flew from tree to tree. I'm always sticking close, cawing every so often just to let me know he was still there to watch over me. It was honestly such a boost. The fall has really rocked my confidence, and to know that nature had its own way of being so kind, so compassionate. It really picked me up at a time I absolutely needed it. However, it wasn't long until my ankle began to really swell up from the sprain, and obviously with the swelling came an increased amount of pain. Now I know this might sound crazy, but that intense pain in my inability to properly escape it. It brought back the memories of childbirth, and as I sat there on a fallen log, taking the weight off my ankle, I found myself bursting into tears. And just like something out of a Disney movie, down swooped my little crow friend who began his same little song and dance of concern. It made my heart swell at the time, it really did. It really was like a Disney story, something the crying princess and her little bird friend. But then, in what I thought was a beautiful moment, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Something was moving through the trees about 100 yards up the slope. Something huge. Something that drooled when it saw me sitting on that fallen log. It was a grizzly bear, fresh out of hibernation, and it was obviously starving. What I thought was my little crow friend began its song and dance again, only this time it was intensely more frenzy than it had been before. I thought it was a warning. I couldn't have been more wrong. The bear began a rapid descent down the slope towards me, panting as it hurtled through the trees. I was ready for it. I had managed to pick up the most potent bear mace I could get my hands on, one of the things my new Reddit hiking buddies had insisted I purchased. I pulled it out, flipped off the safety catch, and sprayed a huge mist of bright yellow mace into the air in front of me. I was terrified, convinced that it just wouldn't work. For some reason, that the bear would just be too hungry, would take the pain and tear me limb from limb right there on the forest floor. But it worked. It actually worked. As soon as the grizzly hit that stinging yellow mist, it stopped dead in its tracks, blinked its eyes before it began to violently sneeze, and watched as the mace began to take effect. I didn't bother to stick around and revel in the victory. I mean, who would? I just ran. Ran in till my ankle felt like it was about to explode. But thankfully, some small act of God's mercy led me right back to my car, and somehow I actually made it home. I lived to be able to tell this tale. But when I did a little research, and when I thought was my little crow friend, what it seemed like a Disney-style friendship between Beauty and Beast was anything but that. As it turns out, crows and bears have something of a special relationship. Often upon sighting a wounded or infirm animal, a crow will fly down from a tree and call like the devils, not out of any kind of concern, but in order to direct a large predator, often a bear, onto the wounded creature. Once the bear had finished chowing down, the crow can eat the scraps. And that day in the woods could have very well ended with me being the scraps. Mount Fuji is one of the highest volcanoes in all of Asia, and happens to be one of the most sacred sites in all of Japan. The mountain is a cultural icon, and on a clear day, those busying themselves with work or home life in the capital of Tokyo are able to see the mountain's exceptionally symmetrical snow-capped peaks in the far distance. Mount Fuji is a regular fixture in art and photographs, being one of the most common scenes depicted on Japanese postcards, thousands of which are sent all around the world from Japan each year. But on the northwestern side of Mount Fuji, sat onto 30 square kilometers of hardened lava, lies a forest known as Kagara. The Akahana forests, sometimes known as the Sea of Trees, can be extremely dense in places, with the porous lava rock red of the forest having properties which make it adept at absorbing sound waves. This can give visitors a sense of absolute solitude, making it a popular destination for other less savory activities, such as hiking or camping. C. The Akara has a historical reputation in Japan for being home of the Yuri, a name given to the ghosts of the dead in Japanese mythology. This is down to a number of reasons, but the most prevalent is the fact that the Akihabara is known quite bluntly as a forest in which people take their lives. Every year, scores of Japanese men and women venture into the forest to end their lives. These incidents have become too frequent over the past 50 years or so, that Japanese authorities have placed signs at the head of some trails urging visitors to think of their families and to contact prevention hotlines. In 2003 alone, over 100 bodies were located in the Akihabara, an increase from the previous year's 78. During the year 2010, Japanese police noted that more than 200 people have attempted to end their lives in the forest, with just over 50 of them having completed the morbid act, undeterred by the many signs and warnings given to those who venture out there. Perhaps the most common method in the deep woods near Mount Fuji. Overdoses are hanging, although many more creative methods have been observed by the annual body searches conducted by police, volunteers, and journalists. It is also morbidly interesting to note that the rate in which this happens in Japan increases during the month of March, being the end of the fiscal year for Japanese businesses, and so much so that in recent years, local officials have had a huge effort to stop publicizing the numbers and figures in an attempt to curb the Akihabara's popularity as a destination for this kind of act. The site's popularity has often been attributed to Saiko Matsumoto's 1961 novel Nami Noto, known in English as The Tower of Waves. The novel is the story of the Japanese couple who, on discovering that fate has rendered it impossible for them to be together, happy take a trip into the deep woods near Mount Fuji, wherein they end their lives together. It is still considered one of the most romantic novels ever published on the Japanese market, but the blame for the deaths in the Akihabara could not be placed squarely at the feet of Mr. Matsumoto, for there is another book written by the author Wataru Sarumi that details the hardness of living in Japanese society. It is known as Kunsen Kisetsu Manru, or the Complete Manual of Ending Your Life, first published on July 4th. 1993, the book went on to sell more than 1 million copies in the Japanese domestic literature market alone. In the postscript, Sarumi says to think that at the worst crucial moment one can escape from the pain. By ending their own life, one can live for the moment easier. So by distributing this book, I want to make this stifling society an easier place to live in. This is the aim of this book, and I never intend to encourage readers to end their own life. Although the book is quite clearly an instruction manual, the author explains his philosophy throughout in opposition to the social pressure to live strong. He details every method, rating different aspects of each technique, such as painfulness, gruesomeness of the body's probability of failure, and cost and event of failure. The fact that one can easily identify the least painful and easiest method of such is and was extremely controversial at the time of publication. However, the history of ending your own life in Akihabara predates both novels' publication, and the place has long been associated with death. For example, there is a practice in Japan known as ubatsute, which literally translates to abandoning an old woman, whereby an infirm or elderly relative was carried to a mountain or some other remote, desolate place, and left there to die. Despite being an ancient or archaic practice, abandoning of the elderly was practiced in Japan well into the 19th century, long after other cultures had abandoned it in favor of the elongation of life, palliative care, or general comfort and respect for the elderly. It is this that primarily led Akihabara to be thought of as haunted by the yuri of those left to die there. However, despite local authorities' efforts to curtail interest in the forest, fairly recent events have brought public attention back towards it in a huge way. All thanks to a YouTuber by the name of Logan Paul. Though Ohio native faced a huge online backlash over a YouTube video he posted during a visit to Japan, one of which showed the body of apparently a victim of someone who took their own life. The blog-style posts entailed Logan with his friends heading into the forest to film the so-called haunted woods. There they came across a man's body. It is clear that they were incredibly shocked by what they saw before them, with a couple of screenshots of Logan's expression being the mainstay of video thumbnails. But outrage was widespread when Paul and his accompaniment began to apparently make jokes, making light of an incredibly dark situation and inviting a torrent of criticism upon them. The identity of the deceased man is not known, and Paul's production team had taken the time to blur out the man's facial features. Online comments have called the Japan video, which garnered millions of views, on YouTube before it was taken down, disrespectful and disgusting. Paul's channels were removed from YouTube's Google Preferred program, where brands sell ads on the platform's top 5% of content creators. YouTube also said it had put on hold original projects with the US blogger on average every year in Japan. More than 25,000 people take their own lives. That's 70 every single day, the vast majority being men. The grim self-immolation of a 71-year-old man aboard a Japanese bullet train in 2014 once again rammed the issue back into the headlines as he tipped the liquid over himself. He is reported to have shooed away at the passengers, telling them it was dangerous. What drove a quiet elderly man to douse himself with fuel and set fire to it in a packed carriage on a speeding train? Why do people choose life over death? They're questions that may well go unanswered for as long as there are human beings. To ask them, and as long as there are, The Akihabara forests will still have those little colored ribbons for those souls not quite lost to find their way back. The scariest story I've ever heard was told me by my grandfather. He was a soldier during the Second World War, enlisting on the day he turned 18 on March 3rd, 1944. The timing meant he missed the D-Day, landings, as well as all the horrors associated with it. But he arrived on the Western Front just in time to take part in something arguably much worse: the invasion of the German homeland. Looking back with the kind of 20/20 vision that hindsight gives you, it seems obvious that Germany was destined to lose the war, squeezed under the combined weights of the Allied, Soviet armed forces. But in the moment, during the day-to-day fighting in the fields and forests of Northern Europe, the future seemed anything but certain. In fact, Germany was still convinced it could win the war using atomic bomb technology, stubborn defensive tactics, or a combination of the two. The Germans were far from convinced that their fight was over, and it was into this new phase of the war that my grandfather found himself in during a nightmarish push into the German heartland that would prove just as terrifying as anything that had preceded it, if not more so. On the 2nd of October 1944, the Battle of Aachen began. The city had been incorporated into the Siegfried Line, the main defensive network on Germany's western border, and the Allies hoped to capture it quickly before advancing into the industrialized Ruhr Basin to land the knockout blow to German manufacturing capabilities. However, a few miles south of the city lay a place known as Hurtgrunwald, or Hurtgen Forest. It was here that over 80,000 German soldiers were based in the U.S. Army Task Force, sent into the woods, intended to pin them down, and prevent them from reinforcing the city of Aachen. It's there that my grandfather's story occurs. So without further ado, this is what happened to him. He and his platoon had been tasked with a routine patrol through the woods, probing for the German defensive line in which they would call in artillery and air support. It has been a quiet morning, but that calm was shattered when a distant rifle shot sent one of his platoon mates crashing into the dirt. The soldiers tried to find what little cover they could, but it took a few minutes before they could work out just which angle the shots were coming from. And in that time, 3 or 4 other Americans fell to that German sniper's bullets. A few men tried to tactically withdraw under covering fire from their fellow soldiers, but the sniper kicked them off before they could get away. Before long, the entire platoon was pinned down by the sniper, completely unable to move without being shot down where they stood. But as horrendous as that sounds, that's not the part that stuck with them. That's what came next. The platoon's radio man had been the one shot during the initial ambush and had bled to death pretty quickly, lying lifeless in a slight clearing among the trees. Anytime any of the soldiers tried to pull the man's radio unit to safety, the sniper would let off a shot, ensuring they kept their distance. One brave soul actually managed to get a hand on the radio, but through obscene skill or just. And luck, the sniper managed to put a bullet through the upper section of the palm, basically blowing out his finger ligaments and rendering his hand useless. To their absolute horror, there was no way for any of them to call in artillery or air support. Effectively, more than 20 men were completely at the mercy of one German sniper. My grandfather told me that on numerous occasions, a soldier might shift to little in place, maybe peek up to see if they could spot the sniper's firing position, and each time the man would fall dead or scream out in pain as the bullet whizzed through the trees and found its mark. And each time the sniper fired and cut down another American in cold blood, he would laugh. He laughed so loud it would echo through the trees around them. My grandfather said that was the sound that he could never, ever forget hearing. The joy in the German sniper's laugh, the raw, violent delight he felt when his bullet struck home. Sometimes he would shout something, a phrase my grandfather couldn't understand. That had translated later on manner of Venanda Aken their more crying children. That sniper had my grandfather's platoon pinned down for about 6 full hours, but to him it felt like days. They had to just lie there perfectly still as the dead open eyes of their fallen comrades stared at them, looks of shock and horror on their lifeless faces. At one point, the sniper, unable to spy any living targets through his high-powered scope, began to fire upon the dead in an attempt to break the platoons psychologically. My grandfather told me. The entire platoon winced in disgust and terror as a bullet smashed into a dead man's skull. He had bled out leaning up against a tree and was, evidently still well within the sniper sights. Of all the wounds and injuries my grandfather saw during the war, he told me head wounds were always the worst. Once the structural integrity of the human skull is compromised, be it by bullet or shrapnel, or from the blunt force of a rifle, but a person's face changes shape. The first bullet that hit the dead man's skull practically split it in two, right down the middle. But nothing I can write will outdo the exact horrific manner in which my grandfather described it. I've known that guy for months. I could recognize him in the dark just from his gait. But now I didn't recognize him at all, his eyes way too far apart. He looked inhuman. But the sniper didn't stop there. He laughed and laughed and laughed as he sent 2 bullets, then 3, then 4, sailing into the dead man's skull, pulverizing it, until it's just a mess of broken bone and leaking brain matter. Eyeballs, still connected by the optical nerve dangled from shattered eye sockets. I can't even imagine how traumatic that must have been for a kid who was barely 18 years old. I mean, he was still a kid, a child. I think back to when I was 18. I could barely handle seeing a paper cut, let alone seeing someone's entire head explode. His platoon had to wait until nightfall to escape. They did. SOS barks of Fagling, fickling echoed through the trees. Cowards, cowards. The German sniper called them in between volleys of that perverted, manic laughter. My grandpa said that he still expected to be shot as they ran back the way they came. Try not to have head-on collisions with tree trunks as they did. One man was so terrified he actually did run straight into a tree, broke his nose, but just got up and kept running. Grandpa died last year, so I considered this a little tribute to a great man who went through terrible times. Rest in peace, Grandpa.